If you have your Bibles, Hebrews 11 is where we are headed this morning. Hebrews 11. If you were with us last year, we spent most of last year from January through November in the book of Hebrews. We went chapter by chapter, verse by verse, and just studying what this writer had to say to this specific church. And we got to November and we decided to stop. And we stopped at the end of chapter 10. And some of you guys were frustrated because the most famous passage in Hebrews is Hebrews 11. You guys know Hebrews 11 and all of the stories. And it wasn't theology at that point. It was stories of people. And we stopped early. And you guys wanted to hear about these people that are called our heroes of faith. And so this morning we start back up, and we're over the next month or so, we'll be in Hebrews 11, 12, and 13, and studying again what God is teaching us from this letter that was written to a church that was struggling, that was going through incredible hardship. So what I want to do this morning is read Hebrews 11, verses 1 through 7, and then we'll look at some things about what the Bible teaches about faith, what our passage teaches about faith, and we'll go from there. So Hebrews 11, 1 through 7. Now faith is this, hold on. Somehow it changed to, hold on. I'm going to read it in KJV. Hopefully you guys can pick along or it'll be behind me. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the convictions of things not seen. Verse 2. For by it the people of old received their commendation. Verse 3. By faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. Verse 4. By faith Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts. And through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. By faith, Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death, and he was not found because God had taken him. Now, before he was taken, he was commended as having pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. Finally, verse 7. By faith, Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of righteousness that comes by faith. Hebrews 11 is a story of people who are heroes of our faith. And what I want to do this morning is to address the question, what is faith? What is faith? The reality is that we have a hard time defining faith. So I began to look up definitions of what faith is, and it's fascinating to see how people have defined it. And here's just a few definitions. Faith is an allegiance to a person or a thing. Another definition is faith is a firm belief in something to which there is no proof. Another definition, belief that does not rest on logical proof. Another one is faith is to hold on to something without question. And my favorite was from the Urban Dictionary. If you've ever looked on the Urban Dictionary, it's a little risque, but it says faith is insubstantial, irrational belief not supported by evidence or reason, but assumption alone. Faith is glorified ignorance. That's how Urban Dictionary defines faith. And if you were to go and talk to your friends that have a different belief system than you do, they might describe faith as something that's blind. It's a leap into something that's absurd, against reason, against proof, against things that are not true. It's culturally conditioned, meaning that the reason you believe what you believe is because you were taught that way from a young age. That was your environment. That's how you were trained. You were born in Texas, where everyone believes in God. That's what you were taught. Others will tell you that faith is an evolutionary hangover, something that most people have gotten over, but there are a few who haven't completely gotten over it yet. Others say that faith is for the mentally inferior, or it's a mystical thing, or something that you hold on to for good luck. And there are all kind of ideas out there about what faith is. In fact, you get put into groups of faith. We're called people of faith, or a person of faith, or a women of faith. And if you inquire what faith usually means, Usually it means someone or something that's linked to politics or involved in protest or people that meet in lavish buildings or wear funny clothes. That's what society thinks of what people of faith are. Go do a Google image search of what the definition, or put in Google image search, person of faith. And outside of people that have funny headgear or beads or outfits, the other main prominent things that you find on that page is guns and politicians, persons of faith. In fact, I did this the other day. There was even a Jesus figurine that you could use to play with because that's a person of faith. Our modern idea of faith is so far-fetched from Hebrews 11 and what faith really is. And what Hebrews 11 does is it doesn't just define what faith is for us, it actually begins to show us what faith looks like. And even though there's a small definition in verse 1, it begins the idea of what faith is going to be unpacked for us as we work through the chapter. And instead of simply giving a definition, the writer says, I'm going to give you imagery, and I'm going to give you stories, and I'm going to give you examples of what faith looks like. This is a long chapter, and it's called The History of Faith. And the reason that's here in Hebrews is because the writer is talking and encouraging a group of believers who are trying to trust God in the midst of horrible circumstances. This is a group of believers that are facing hardships in their lives for being followers of Jesus. They've lost their possessions. Their family members have disowned them. Culture has rejected them. Government authorities are after them. They've been thrown into prison. They've been ostracized from culture. And in living in ancient Rome, which is the most modern city of that time, a postmodern society, a pluralistic society, a society that has many different religions, and everything is acceptable except worshiping Jesus. Everything was fine except you can't worship Jesus. And here's a small group of believers that would meet in house churches, and they're struggling in their faith. They're wondering if Jesus is worth it. Everyone is ridiculing them. Everyone's making fun of them. And the writer of Hebrews is writing to them to encourage them that Jesus is more than enough for them. He reminds them, listen, guys, you're not alone in this. And in Hebrews 11, he's going to show them other people that have, and what they've gone through for their faith in God and how they made it. And if they can make it, you can make it as well. So these people have heard from Hebrews 1 through 10 about how marvelous Jesus is. The writer told them that Jesus is better than the angels. He's better than Moses. He's better than Abraham. He's better than the old covenant. He's better than the tabernacle. He's better than the law. He's better than the temple. He's better than all of this stuff. And the writers and the people that are listening to this are asking the questions. Listen, I understand Jesus is better than all of this stuff. I understand he's better than the law and the Old Testament, all the things that we used to do. All of those things about Jesus is great. It's wonderful. It's true. Jesus is better. But the question I have is, if Jesus is so much better than all of this stuff, how come life is so hard? How come life is so difficult? Why is it so painful to follow Jesus when we thought Jesus would be better? And the writer is going to say, let me show you examples of people who have followed Jesus and how it's worth following in your life. And he's going to parade in front of them different people. And he's going to use the word faith 24 times in Hebrews 11. And he's going to line these people in front of them and in front of us. And he's going to show them, some of them with wounds and scars on their bodies, some of them holding their heads in their hands because they've been beheaded for their faith. And these people are going to line up and they're going to tell us, listen, it's worth it. It's worth following Jesus. He can be trusted. When we're to see men and women who are going to speak to us and remind us that we're not alone. Sometimes in a culture like ours, when someone comes to Jesus for the first time, it feels like they're starting something new. But the reality is that we have a long line that goes before us. There's a long line of people who have trusted and given their lives for Jesus and believed just as we have believed. There are many people who have chose to follow Jesus and things didn't go well in their life. And we are linked to something that has history. We aren't here this morning to invent something new, to discover something new. We're here this morning to look at what has been passed down to us from generation to generation to generation of people that have followed Jesus. So we're going to look at faith through the lives of individuals. And one thing that you're going to find when you read Hebrews 11, and let me encourage you to read that over the next several weeks, is that we're going to find people that have serious flaws in their lives. They weren't perfect people. They had issues. Think about Samson. Samson's in our chapter, and he's a man of faith. But read his story in Judges. The guy was screwed up. He had issues, major issues in his life. He was sleeping around. He gets caught because he gave away his secret, and he dies a horrible death, basically like a suicide bomber. He gives up his life so that he could kill other people. And yet he's a man of faith. There's a guy in the chapter by the name of Jephthah. He was a judge. He promises God that if God gives him victory in a battle, he'll sacrifice the first person that he sees when he comes home. The first person he sees when he comes home is his daughter. So he sacrifices his daughter. And yet he's called a man of faith. These are the people that God says, look at them. And what's commended about them is that they had faith in God and trusted God with their lives, even though they were flawed. And listen, that should encourage us this morning. Because all of us have flaws. None of us have our act together. But these men and women trusted God despite what was going on in their lives. And today what I want to do is I want to take that word faith and I'm going to put it under the microscope and see it from different angles so that we can get a well-rounded understanding of what faith is. And my hope is that this morning that you'll be challenged in your thinking of what faith is, because for some of you, your definition of faith is not what the biblical definition of faith is at all. And then 5 specific things I want to look at. Faith, number 1, involves questions. Number 2, it involves reasoning. Number 2 involves a reaction. Number 4, it involves reaching. And number 5, it involves risk-taking. This is what faith encompasses. The first thing we want to do is that faith involves questions. At the very heart of faith is questions. Some of you have been taught that it's wrong to ask questions. Some of you have been taught in church that you don't ask questions, you just obey and do whatever you have been told. But can I suggest to you that the heart of Christianity is questions? And that may sound odd to you, so let me explain. Verse 1 says, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for. What does it mean to hope for something? It means that the current state of your life is a state of discontentment. If there is hope in you, it's because you look around at life and you look at the world and you have found things to be unsatisfactory. Things don't make sense. At the core of hope is the idea of questions about what's in front of you. Those of you guys who are single and hope to one day be married, the reason you hope to get married is because you look at your current state of life and you're single and it sucks. And you want something better. And so you hope that you will find the man of your dreams or the woman of your dreams, and maybe it's a false hope, but you hope that life will be better when you're married. We hope for more money because you look at your current finances and it stinks. You have no money. And because you're poor right now, you hope that one day you'll have more money. Hope is looking at your current circumstances and saying, there's got to be something better than this. It's the heart that says that this isn't it. There's more to life than what I'm seeing right now, more to life than what I can feel and see and taste and touch. It's a sense that something is wrong with the way that life is right now. Something's broken, something's not right. And this is where faith begins. It's the questions. It's the feeling that there's something out there that's got to be better than where it is right now. And this is where faith is birthed. Before you came to Christ, you didn't give God a lot of consideration. When you weren't a Christian, you probably didn't ask a lot of questions because you probably thought you figured everything out on your own. And then God shakes you up and all of a sudden, questions start popping up. What's going on? Why am I here? Where did I come from? What's my purpose? Where am I headed? Is there a God? If there is a God, how do I find him? If there is a God, does he accept me? What do I need to do to get his approval? All of these questions begin to pop up. Real faith asks questions. Before God intervened, you had no questions. When God intervened, you began to ask questions. C.S. Lewis called this the secret signature of the soul. He said it's something we all have, this homesickness that we all have. We desire to be at home, but we don't know where home is. We just know that this isn't it. There's got to be more. It's questions that that is so real that it hurts. Something that's so real that we can't even articulate it or run from it, even though we try to. Maybe you're here this morning and you're not a follower of Jesus and you have questions and you try to smother those questions by getting busy at life and doing things and getting occupied, and you try to push those questions away, but it never works. They keep popping up. It's like cooking a pot of rice. You put the rice into the bowl and you put water in and turn the heat on. Eventually it starts bubbling up and to the point that it overflows. The only way it stops bubbling is you take it off the fire. You remove the fire from it. But God has designed it in a way that He has eliminated a possibility for us to take out the fire. So no matter where you are, the questions keep coming. You try to run, but the questions keep popping up. Desire for something better. We never had this thing that our soul longs for. We've seen glimpses of it, but we've never fully experienced it. We see glimpses of it in music or landscape, but it's not the thing itself. The music and landscapes and all of God's creation are just reminders of what our heart truly longs for. They disguise themselves as messengers to tell us that we're made for something better, made for a greater purpose, made to experience the unending love of an eternal God. Faith in God begins when we realize that this is true. It comes with the conviction that there is something more than just this. There is something beyond me. Something is not right. Something is broken. Someone has to fix it. I can't fix it. Someone has to come and fix it. And when you come to the conviction that these questions are unanswerable by yourself, that there has to be more out there, this is when faith begins in your journey toward God. Think about this chapter and the people in this chapter. There's a guy by the name of Abraham. Abraham was living a comfortable life. And one day God shows up and now questions start popping up. And Abraham realizes that there's more to life than what he's doing. And he leaves everything and he leaves his family and he begins to follow God to a place he doesn't know where he's going. He just feels compelled to go because God began to put questions into his heart. Moses was living the good life. He was the prince of Egypt. He had everything he wanted. Whatever he wanted was at his beck and call. And one day he sees a Hebrew slave being murdered, and something hits his soul, and he begins to ask the questions. This isn't right. Why is this going on? Why is this happening? What's my purpose? And all of a sudden he identifies with them, and he murders someone, and he runs away, and he begins this journey in his faith with God. Listen, faith begins by asking questions. That's where it begins. Listen, we have our doubts, we have our fears. When we begin to hope for something better, it speeds along and it becomes a conviction that says, there's got to be something better. But how can we be sure? Where do we go from there? Is it just about asking questions? No. It moves forward from there, and that takes us to the second point that says that faith involves reasoning. Faith involves reasoning. Here's the second part of our definition in verse 1. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Faith begins with a sense that there is something greater. It leads to a conviction that there is something out there, which leads to us thinking, examining, and considering. That's what the definition is. Faith involves logic. Listen, that may sound shocking to some of you, because a lot of us have been taught that you just believe without thinking. That's not true. You think this through. Biblical faith is rational. The word conviction in this passage means to validate through reason. Verse 3 says that by faith we understand. The Bible does not say that faith is separated from reason. It actually teaches that faith is reasonable. Faith is a tool that helps you make sense of what you see and what you sense is wrong. It's like a flashlight. It helps us see through the darkness of this world. When you first began asking questions about the reality around you, about God and about you and who you are and where you came from and where you're going, all of those big questions in life, when you began to ask those questions, what you did was you opened the front door of your house and you stepped out and you realized that it's not clear out there. It isn't light out there, it's dark. And you can't see much. And the questions led you to a place of darkness. I thought it was going to be light. I thought it was going to be clear. I thought when I stepped out, I was going to understand everything. But the reality is I don't. Faith is the flashlight that you turn on to help you see what is out there and make sense of what you see. That's what faith is. Listen, faith is a flashlight that all of us reach for to make sense of what we see. Don't misunderstand that. Faith is what everyone reaches for, regardless of what they believe about God. Because only by faith can you explain what you see. The writer in verse 3 says, "By faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible." Basically, the writer is saying that what we see is not self-explanatory. I can't just look at a piece of leaf and explain it away of where it came from and how it got there. I need faith to reason behind how it came to be. And no matter what conclusion I come to, you got to leap into faith to begin to understand how it got here, because you can't reproduce it. Faith is what everyone uses to explain the world. The theory with the most explanation power is the one you have to go with. You reason through what makes sense of what I see. It helps you explain the world. Let me give you another C.S. Lewis quote. C.S. Lewis said, "I believe the sun is risen, not only because I see it, but because by it, I see everything else." It explains what I see out there. That's why the psalmist would write, "Your light, O God. In your light, O God, I see light." The puzzle pieces of my life that once were scattered all over the place, though it's not fully complete yet, are slowly starting to come together by faith. I still have questions. Listen, Christianity is not believed because it's perfectly coherent, it perfectly makes sense, it puts all of the pieces together, but it begins to put the most pieces together. There's still doubts, there's still questions, there's still things that I don't have the answers to, there's still things that God does that makes me shake my head and say, why did you allow that? I still have questions and doubts, but listen, the alternative is a much greater leap. It's much harder to disprove God's existence than to prove it. Let me give you a couple of worldviews for you to understand. I know you're not in philosophy class, and I know some of you are already in summer mode already, but you got to understand this to understand where people come from. They won't use these titles, but this gives you an idea of worldviews. The first idea is the idea of pantheism. Pantheism basically says that the whole universe is basically God or a part of God. God doesn't have a distinct personality. He's not different from the world. He's part of the world. He's no longer unchanging either, because if the world is changing and if God is part of the world, then God changes as well. Therefore, morals and values are subject to culture. It changes. It changes according to the times. What you used to believe is irrelevant now because the world has changed, so God has changed. But the Bible affirms that we aren't pantheists. We don't believe that God is part of the world. We believe that God is separate from the world. The world changes. God never changes. He is constant. He's the same. See, this is the core of world religions like Hinduism or Buddhism, where the goal is that we lose our distinctiveness, that we reach this place of nirvana where we cease to exist or we become part of the world. These are pantheistic teachings. The second teaching is the idea of dualism. This is Star Wars theology. It's the fighting of good versus evil, and they're both equally powerful, that there's good out there, there's bad out there. Some days good wins and some days bad wins, and you just never know who's going to win today. They're both fighting, they're both competing, the good versus the bad. The problem with that worldview is that God can never win at the end because they're constantly fighting. Because God and the universe are running side by side. They have equal power. They've eternally existed, so forever there will be this battle between good and evil. But that's not what the Bible teaches. The Bible teaches that God has already won the victory, hasn't he? The third worldview, which I'm going to spend some time on this morning, is the idea of materialism. It's the idea that this universe is all there is. All that you see is all that there is. All that you see is what you can touch, what you can feel, what you can prove and attest to. This eliminates a supreme judge over the universe. Therefore, everything goes and everything is acceptable. If you take this to the logical end, the social repercussions of this are unbelievable. For example, a few months ago, The Chinese government came out with this report. The government came out with this report that over the last few decades, they have aborted 336 million babies. 336 million babies. That's what the government said. And the report said most of them were not by choice. The government forced it on them. This is the greatest slaughter in human history. You take the top 8 wars with the most human casualties and combine the casualties, it doesn't equal to the number of babies that have been murdered in China over the last several decades. This is the social repercussion of materialism. If this is all there is, this world, and we don't want more people occupying and populating this planet and taking the resources of this planet, what difference does it make if babies live or die? If this is all there is, then this makes sense. See, the lack of faith in our culture is not because people are thinking too much, it's because people aren't thinking enough. They haven't thought it through. They haven't examined. They just push it away and they don't want to think about it and they want to live for themselves and they buy into a worldview that they haven't thought through. But Christianity is reasonable. Think it through. Think it through. Some by faith believe that we are mutations of scum that we scrape off of our bathroom showers, that we mutated from that. They claim that we have evolved, even though you look around and you see that everything around us is devolving, not evolving. And we take by faith that God created the world. Many people by faith believe that nothing or chance created the world. I want you to take that to its logical end. Think about this, and I'll let R.C. Sproul speak to this. Here's a fascinating quote that he said, and I'll have it behind me. Here's what he says. He says, before the world began, there was nothing. But what in the world is nothing? Have you ever tried to think about nothing? Where can we find it? Obviously nowhere. Why? Because it's nothing, and nothing doesn't exist. It can exist because if it did, it would be something and not nothing. Are you starting to get a headache like me? Think about it for a second. I can't tell you to think about it because nothing isn't an it. I can only say nothing isn't. How can we think about nothing? We can't. It simply isn't possible. If we try to think about nothing, we always end up thinking about something. There are people out there that believe the world was created by nothing. There's a world of a difference between saying that the world was created from nothing and the world was created by nothing. The worldview that says the world was created by nothing is actually more miraculous than saying that the world was created from nothing. It suggests that nothing created something. More than that, it suggests that nothing created everything. They won't say nothing, they say the universe was created by chance. But what's chance? Chance isn't a thing. It's no weight, it has no measure, it has no power. It's merely a word that we use to describe mathematical possibilities. It can do nothing. It can do nothing because it is nothing. To say that the universe was created by chance is to say that it came from nothing. Guys, that doesn't make sense. The idea that the world came from nothing is like suggesting a tornado goes through a junkyard and eliminates everything, and on the other side comes a brand new 747 jumbo airline. It doesn't happen. And yet that's what they suggest. Somehow something came along and all of a sudden this magnificent earth was created. Faith is not a feeling, it's not an optimism, it's not blind, it's not sentiment. It is solid, reasonable conviction that is resting on God's word that makes sense of what we see. Think through it. He made it. Number 3, faith involves a response. Listen, all of this flows together. Faith starts with a deep sense of longing that leads to questions about what we once believed to be true. It leads to convictions that this can't be all there is, and that leads to questions and reasons to explain what we see, what we don't see. But listen, all of that is not true saving faith. This is not the faith that the writer of Hebrews is talking about. Faith must move to a response. The early church fathers believed that faith began with understanding, leads to conviction, and completes itself in commitment. Faith has to involve all of those things. It has to have a response. This is what we see in the life of Abel. Look at verse 4. By faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts, and through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. So here we have the first family, Adam and Eve and their kids. Their sons share a lot in common. They have the same parents. They make the same offerings to God. Both are worshiping God. We would consider both of them to be men of faith because they are sacrificing to God. Both of them knew they had to bring an offering, but how did they know they had to bring an offering? I think deep down they knew that they couldn't come to God empty-handed. They knew they couldn't come to God with nothing. Listen, we're all people of faith that make offerings for every relationship that we have. You can't come just as you are. We try to sell ourselves. We try to get approval. We try to hide our flaws. We try to show our strengths. Guys, it's called dating. It's awful, but that's what we do. You don't go on a date and tell your date, hey, I'm really lazy. I sit in my parents' basement or in my parents' room and play video games all day and borrow their money and borrow their car and borrow their stuff, and I have nothing good to say about myself. That's not what you do on your date. No, you're making stuff up. You'll go in and you'll say, listen, I've mastered the art of technology. I get to work from home, and I figured out a way to be able to get a home and car and food without spending a penny on it, and you'll make yourself look good. The reality is we all do this. We all bring offerings, not just to God, we bring them to others and to ourselves. We spin things around to make ourselves look better because we desperately want people to like us. We can't go long without the approval of others. Cain and Abel felt the same way, and they tried to fix it. The apple didn't fall far from the tree, did it? Because that's exactly what their parents did. They messed up, and they saw they messed up, and they tried to fix it. They took some fig leaves and covered themselves because they needed to fix it. Cover themselves up. And notice Cain and Abel are very different. One involves a faith response in God. One involves a faith response in self. That's what made Cain's sacrifice more acceptable. Listen, God didn't accept Cain's sacrifice because God hates vegetarians and loves steak. That's not why Abel's sacrifice was accepted. Abel followed what his parents taught him. What did his parents teach him? Cain, Abel, when we were in the garden, we sinned. We messed up. And what did God have to do? He had to sacrifice an animal for our sins and use the skin of that animal to cover us. Something had to die for our sins. Abel knew, not clearly, but he knew that something or someone had to die in his place so that he can be acceptable to God. That's why he offered what he did. He was approved by God, not because of his works, not because of what he did, but because of his faith. What about Cain? The Bible says that Cain went the way of Cain. What's the way of Cain? It's the default human heart. It's the way we go without God. It's saying that we're going to trust in ourselves. This is where he went. To truly understand faith is to move from faith in yourself to move to faith in God. It involves not just questioning and reasoning, but a wholehearted response to the gospel. Number 4, faith involves reaching. Faith involves reaching. This is important because you can easily turn into a very reasonable, logical thing. Faith can turn into a reasonable, logical thing that becomes very academic. The writer is going to say faith isn't just something that you think or know up here, but it's relational. It involves reaching. It involves much deeper, experiential, passionate reaching for God. Faith moves from having questions to having convictions that is figured out through reasoning, that moves to reaching for an act of God. It's active. It is going hard after Jesus. The writer is going to show us in the next verse that Enoch walked with God. He walked with God. It was experiential. It was close. It was relational. Look at verse 5. It says, by faith Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death. And he was not found because God had taken him. Now before he was taken, he was commended as having pleased God. How did he please God? By faith. You go back to Genesis and you read the story of Enoch. Here's what you discover. Enoch didn't start following God till he was 65 years old. At the age of 65, he had a son. And that woke him up and realized that there's got to be more to life than just what I'm doing. And he began to pursue God and follow God. Something happened. Life didn't seem simple anymore. There was complexity there. So he meets God, and basically Enoch and God become best friends. He's walking around daily, and it looks like he's talking to himself. Listen, when you're a toddler and you're talking to yourself, that's normal. When you're 65 and you're talking to yourself, you're weird. But Enoch is daily walking around, and he's talking to God. He does this on a daily basis, and one day God just says, you know what? Why don't you just come home? See, what was so compelling about God that caused Enoch to walk so closely with him? Verse 6 says that because God was all satisfying. He was a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. The reward of joy. Faith, we believe in God, is not just true, it's effective. People in our culture want something that's either true or effective. Most people want something that just makes them feel good. The Bible is saying here that faith isn't just effective and life-transforming and experiential, but faith is true, it's reasonable, it makes sense of what we see. It's both. Verse 6 says that without faith, it's impossible to please God. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and he rewards those who seek him. Enoch was 65 and he had a either-or experience. You ever have that? An either-or? Where logic turns into reason? Either there is no God and nothing matters, or there is a God and I need to find out who he is. That's the either-or experience that Enoch had. Enoch realized that if God is God, then he must be what Enoch was made for, what his heart was longing for. Enoch discovered this as you walked with God on a daily basis. And he still speaks to us today to remind us that God rewards those who diligently seek him, that God is intimate. One translation says that God is interested. I love that. He's not unaware. He's not apathetic. He's interested. He's interested in you. He's interested in me. He's interested in us. One who invites us to walk into relationship with him, invites us to move from truth to responses of worship to genuine relationship with him. A follower of Jesus by faith seeks true, lasting pleasure. Did you hear that? A follower of Jesus seeks true, lasting pleasure. We don't believe that we're supposed to look like we drank a cup of lemon juice in the morning and looking all grouchy. We believe in pleasure, joy, and satisfaction, but we believe it's not found in this world, but we believe it's found in God. We believe in the ultimate permanent pleasure instead of temporary pleasure. A follower of Jesus ought to be a believer that no matter what discomfort, what pain, what sorrow we have to endure for Christ's sake on earth, we will be more than compensated with an eternity of happiness and joy that we can't even imagine now. That's what should motivate us. The believers in Hebrews didn't give up their possessions and didn't go to prison and didn't lose their lives because that was the Christian thing to do. They gave it up because they knew that what they were experiencing now was nothing compared to the joy that they were going to be experiencing when they saw Jesus. There was a joy in a relationship with that. Number 5, let me close. Faith involves risk-taking. Faith involves risk-taking. Faith begins with a feeling that things aren't right. It leads to questions that lead to reasoning, which leads to a response of worship and joy and relationship that leads to a radical way of life being called a disciple of Jesus. Listen, the life that God is calling us for is not a life for just a few stellar people. This is for normal people, the risk-taking that's involved. Verse 7 says that by faith Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of righteousness that comes by faith. You know, the Noah story has lost complete teeth in our culture. It's now a children's fable. It's how we decorate our nursery. Noah was a guy who took some serious risks and faced some serious scrutiny for following God. Notice the verse here says, events not yet seen. Do you realize that when Noah was building the ark, it had not even rained on the earth yet? Not even once. It never rained, and the guy is building the Titanic in like Oklahoma where there's no water around. He's 500 miles away from the ocean, and he's building this ark, and there's no concept of what rain is. There's no concept of what a flood is. In the middle of the desert. And it's huge. It's too big for him and his family. 120 years of financial investment into this boat. Can you imagine? Listen, you ever done something that was stupid or foolish and you knew that everyone was going to make fun of you for the next day? How long did that last? Maybe a week? Maybe if it was really bad, maybe they picked on you for a few months? 120 years of constant scrutiny. He didn't know what a boat was. No one in that culture knew what a boat was. It's going to rain. What's rain? He didn't know what rain was. What's a boat? He's basically going on the notion that God told him to do it, and if God said to do it, he was going to do it. And so he builds a boat the size of a football field. Listen, faith involves risk-taking. It involves taking risks. It involves obeying Jesus even when culture tells you not to obey Jesus. That's why the writer is saying here, Noah believed God, and he had reverent fear. Reverent fear. What does that mean? It means that he knew that if God was saying something, he knew that God wasn't joking. Noah trembled when God spoke. The people trembled when the water was up to their eyeballs. But Noah listened when God spoke. Everyone trembled, but Noah listened when God spoke initially. And while he was being condemned and mocked by everyone around him, God was commending him because of his faith. Our text says that he also condemned the world. What does that mean? It doesn't mean he was standing in a box in the middle of the city like the DC Talk song. It just means that by faith, he was trusting God. And by him trusting God, it condemned the world because of his faith and trust in God despite of their ridicule. He didn't stop. He didn't quit halfway. He kept going after it because he believed, listen, if God said this, then God knows what he's doing. How did he take such risks? He knew that he was an heir of righteousness. That's what the verse says. He was an heir of righteousness. What's an heir? An heir is someone that gets rich off of someone else dying. Someone else dies, so I get rich. That's an heir. Do you see the picture of the gospel here? Do you see that Noah built an ark and he hid himself inside the ark, and in that the gospel story is coming to play? He told the people that God was going to rescue them if they would go on board and get in the ark. They don't listen, and God's judgment comes down on the people. Everyone perishes except those in the boat. Eventually, the water dries down, and they get back to land. They repopulate the earth, and things go back down again, and sin takes over the world again. But this time, God has a better plan. This time, Jesus will come. And the word says that if we hide ourselves in him, he would take the pulsing of God's wrath and God's judgment upon himself, and we would be rescued. Noah is doing the exact same thing that we do by faith. We hop into Jesus. We get into the ark. He is our refuge. He is our safety. The ark says that things are going bad. We need to hide. Our sin is going to cost us something. We either hide in Jesus or we stay out there and get destroyed. Listen, you must learn to believe promises are better than possessions. Things unseen are better than things seen. Things in heaven out of sight are better than things on earth right before your eyes. That the praise of the invisible God is better than the praise of visible man. Then and only then will you make a choice like Noah and prefer God to the world. Listen, I don't know where you are this morning, but I do know that wherever you are, whoever you are, you're a person of faith. And all of your friends are people of faith. Maybe you're just starting off and you have questions. Listen, we welcome you. Ask your questions. God welcomes your questions. Your questions are free to be asked. You ask your questions, and from there, we'll go to reason. We'll begin to look at it reasonably. Others of you are at that point where you're convicted there's got to be more to life than what you're experiencing right now. More than what you can feel and see and taste and touch. We encourage you to examine the Christian faith. Others of you are there logically, but you haven't responded. You still trust in yourself, and you need to hear the voice of Abel this morning that tells you, trust in God. Put your faith in God. Don't go the way of Cain. Don't trust in yourself. Trust God. Others of you are believers in this room, but you've gone stagnant. And you need to hear the voice of Enoch that says that it's good to walk with God. It's good to be in a relationship with Him. It's good to know Him. It's good to talk to Him. He is a rewarder of those who diligently seek Him. Others of you need to take risk with your faith. You need to be willing, like Noah, to take the ridicule and the mockery and stand up and be counted as a follower of Jesus. Some of you are closet Christians. You're a Christian in here, but you're not a Christian when you walk out there. Be like Noah. This is part of what faith is. Excuse me. Faith is going against the grain of culture and standing for God and loving Him and condemning the world by sticking with and loving God despite the ridicule and the shame you may face for believing it. What's faith? It's you asking the questions that need to be asked. It's you reasoning and thinking through this. It's you responding to what God's doing in your life. It is you reaching and being in relationship with God. It is you taking risk with your life because you know that God is so much better than this. This morning as we come to the communion table, I invite you to examine your heart, your lives, your motives, your ambitions, your desires. Are you living for yourself? Are you living a life of faith that says, God, I trust you no matter what. I trust you with my life. I trust you with my future. I trust you with my eternity. I trust you. Are you a person of faith that says that my hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness? Or are you a person of faith that says, I trust in myself. I believe that I can make it on my own? Would you examine your heart, examine your motives? And as you come to the table this morning, would you be reminded that there's a God who loves you, a God who gave His life for you, a God who took the pelting of the storm of judgment and wrath so that you can be forgiven, you can be accepted, you can be His son, you can be His daughter.